Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Phantom Train. Holly Arnold had always been drawn to the Isle of Wight's untold mysteries. The island, her home, possessed an eerie charm with its fog-drenched cliffs and ancient tales that seemed to whisper on the wind. But tonight, as she boarded the last train from Ryde, something was different. It was a cold September evening, and the coastal winds howled as she stepped onto the nearly deserted platform. The clock overhead read 11:45 p.m. Holly pulled her coat tighter, glancing up at the night sky, which was covered in a thick blanket of dark clouds. The train pulled into the station with a slow, mournful whistle, its headlights cutting through the mist like two watchful eyes. As Holly entered the carriage, she immediately sensed something was off. The train felt unnervingly quiet. Dim yellow lights flickered overhead, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the empty seats. There was no conductor in sight, no other passengers apart from a man and a woman sitting toward the far end. She slid into a seat near the middle, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that clung to her. The train began to move, its engine rumbling through the night as it sped along the coastline, following the same familiar route that had brought her home countless times. But this time, the night felt different, heavier, as if the air itself was pregnant with something unspoken. Holly glanced at her fellow passengers. The man was elderly, dressed in a suit from another era, his face obscured by shadows. The woman was younger, maybe in her early 30s, but her clothes seemed out of place. Something about them screamed old-fashioned. Neither of them had spoken or even looked in her direction. It was as though they were waiting for something, or someone. As the train picked up speed, the windows fogged over with condensation, blocking her view of the outside world. Holly wiped her hand across the glass, only to see a thick, swirling mist beyond the window, hiding the familiar landmarks of the island. The more she looked, the more it felt like the landscape was changing. Suddenly, the train lurched, causing her to grip the armrest. She felt a sudden dip in her stomach, as if the train were speeding up, racing toward something in the dead of night. Holly glanced back at the man and woman. They hadn't moved. They just sat there, staring blankly ahead. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away. She fumbled for it in her bag, grateful for the distraction. But as she unlocked the screen, her heart skipped a beat. No signal. Panic began to crawl up her spine. She stood up and walked toward the front of the carriage, intending to find the conductor, but the door was locked. She rattled it, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and a gust of cold air swept through the train. Holly spun around, eyes wide with fear. The man and woman were gone. The seats they had occupied were now empty, as if they had never been there. Heart pounding, Holly stumbled back to her seat. She tried to calm herself, but her mind raced. Where had they gone? Had they gotten off when she wasn't looking? No, it wasn't possible. The train hadn't stopped. The sound of faint whispers reached her ears, rising above the steady clack of the train's wheels. Holly's breath caught in her throat. The whispers were coming from all around her, but there was no one else on board. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. No answer, only the relentless whispers, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to speak her name. Holly. Holly. She covered her ears, but the voices seeped into her mind like a dark fog. She needed to get off this train. Now. Holly rushed down the aisle toward the emergency brake, her hand reaching for it when the train lurched again. The lights went out completely, plunging her into total darkness. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their tone malicious, as though they were mocking her. The train screeched, the sound so high-pitched it felt like nails dragging across her skull. She braced herself, gripping the wall, and the train suddenly stopped. Silence. Everything was still. The lights flickered back on, dimmer now, casting long, haunting shadows. Holly peered out the window and gasped. The landscape was no longer familiar. The mist had cleared, revealing a barren, rocky wasteland. The train stood at a station, if you could call it that. The platform was crumbling, the stone weathered and cracked as though untouched for centuries. There was no sign of life. Only darkness stretched beyond the edges of the platform, as if the train had arrived at the end of the world. She stumbled back to her seat, her pulse racing. This isn't real, she told herself. It can't be real. But the cold, biting air that seeped in through the cracks in the windows told her otherwise. The train doors hissed open with a metallic groan, and Holly heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the platform. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. She held her breath, hoping, praying that whatever was outside would pass by. But the footsteps stopped right outside her window. She couldn't help it, she looked. A face stared back at her through the glass. Pale, gaunt, and lifeless, its eyes black pits, hollow and soulless. It smiled, revealing a row of jagged, decayed teeth. Holly screamed and backed away, but the face followed, pressing against the window as if trying to enter. The train groaned again, and the doors began to creak open wider. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the carriage like a chorus of the damned. She turned and ran to the other end of the train, her footsteps echoing in the empty carriage. But no matter how fast she ran, the car seemed to stretch on forever, as if she were trapped in some nightmare loop. The doors behind her slammed shut with a deafening thud, and the lights flickered off again, plunging her into darkness. Then a cold hand grabbed her wrist. She whirled around, expecting to see the face from the window. But instead, it was the elderly man from earlier. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were glassy, void of life. "You're not supposed to be here," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. "This train is not for the living." Holly wrenched her arm free and stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean? Where is this train going?" The man smiled, a grotesque, twisted expression that made her stomach churn. "To the other side," he whispered. "Toward the dead room. But you're not dead. Not yet." The train jolted forward again, faster this time. Holly could feel the pull of some unseen force, dragging her toward an inevitable fate. She needed to escape, but how? The windows were sealed, the doors locked, and the train was moving at an impossible speed. Suddenly, the woman appeared beside her, her ghostly figure flickering like a dying light. "You must jump," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "It's the only way. Jump!" Holly cried. "I'll die." The woman's eyes gleamed with sorrow. "Better to risk death than to stay aboard. If you stay, you'll never leave. You'll become one of us." Holly hesitated, the pounding of her heart loud in her ears. But the whispers were growing louder, the faces at the windows multiplying. The dead were coming for her. With a surge of adrenaline, she ran toward the nearest door, her hand gripping the emergency release. She could feel the presence of the spirits closing in, their cold breath on her neck. Without thinking, she pulled the lever and the door flew open, revealing the swirling darkness outside. The wind howled as the train sped through the night. Holly looked back one last time, seeing the dead passengers reaching for her, their eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. She jumped. The sensation was overwhelming. The cold wind tore at her, and for a moment she felt weightless, as though she were falling through endless space. But then, with a sudden jolt, she hit the ground. Everything went black. Holly awoke to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. She blinked, her vision blurry, as she sat up. She was lying on a beach, the familiar coastline of the Isle of Wight stretching before her. The train was gone. Disoriented, Holly stood, her legs trembling. She looked around, but there was no sign of the train, no tracks, and no station. Just the quiet night and the endless sea. Had it all been a dream? But as she turned to leave, her blood ran cold. Etched into the sand, barely visible in the dim moonlight, were the faint outlines of train tracks leading out into the sea. And in the distance, barely audible above the crashing waves, she heard the faint, mournful whistle of a train disappearing into the fog. Holly stared at the faint tracks disappearing into the sea, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The cold night air wrapped around her, but no amount of chill could shake the dread growing inside her. She had escaped the phantom train somehow, but the faint whistle in the distance told her it wasn't over. She stumbled away from the beach, every nerve screaming for her to get as far away from the water as possible. Her legs wobbled beneath her, exhaustion setting in from the terror of the night. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the train ride over and over again. Who were those passengers? Why had the train come for her? And where had it gone? The sea breeze blew stronger, and with it she thought she heard the faintest whisper in the wind, calling her name. Holly. Holly. No, she muttered under her breath, refusing to look back at the tracks. She wouldn't listen to those voices. Not again. She had made it off that train alive, and whatever happened next, she wasn't going back. Stumbling up a narrow path that wound along the cliffs, Holly reached the familiar site of the coastal road leading back to her small village. Lights flickered faintly in the distance. Safety. Home. The road was empty, as expected at this late hour, but the isolation didn't calm her as it usually did. Her mind, still buzzing with confusion and fear, kept flashing back to the image of the hollow-eyed man pressing his face against the train window. Those eyes, black and empty, soulless, lingered in her thoughts like a poison she couldn't shake. As she approached the village, Holly noticed something strange. The lights, which she had seen glowing from a distance, were now flickering more radically, almost as if they were struggling to stay on. She glanced up at the nearest street lamp, which buzzed loudly before sputtering out. Another one blinked out ahead of her. The village was falling into darkness. Panic gripped her again. This was no ordinary power outage. She could feel it. The same presence she had felt on the train was here, seeping into her surroundings like a creeping fog. Holly quickened her pace, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She had to get home, get somewhere safe. But as she rounded the corner to her street, her heart sank. The house where she had grown up, her sanctuary, stood in total darkness. The windows were black, no sign of life or warmth inside. She rushed to the front door, fumbling with her keys. Her hands were shaking, but she managed to unlock it and push the door open. The house was silent, too silent. She flicked on the hallway light, but nothing happened. The darkness remained thick and oppressive. Holly. She froze. The voice had come from inside the house. Slowly she turned around, but the hallway was empty. Her pulse quickened as she stepped cautiously inside, her ears straining to catch any other sound. It's just your imagination, she told herself, but she knew that was a lie. She had heard it clear as day. Someone had spoken her name. The floorboards creaked as she moved toward the living room, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The shadows in the house seemed to stretch and twist, playing tricks on her eyes. She could almost feel them moving, shifting around her, watching her. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and her breath came out in a visible puff of mist. The air felt warm, too cold, too still. And then she heard it again, the faint, mournful whistle of a train, echoing through the night. But this time it wasn't coming from the beach. It was coming from inside the house. Holly's stomach churned as she backed away, the sound growing louder with each passing second. The walls of her home, the place she had always felt safe, began to close in on her, the shadows deepening and darkening until they no longer looked like shadows at all. They looked like figures. Figures that moved. She stumbled back into the hallway, her back slamming against the door as she turned to flee. But as she reached for the handle, she froze. Standing in the doorway was the elderly man from the train. His translucent figure loomed before her, eyes as empty as before, his mouth curled into that same grotesque smile. "You didn't think you could escape, did you?" he whispered. "No one escapes the phantom train." Holly, behind him, the woman appeared. Her sad eyes met Holly's, as if she were apologizing for something. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the house, calling her name over and over again. No, Holly gasped. "No, I got off the train. I'm not dead." The man's smile widened. "It doesn't matter. Once you've boarded the train, you're bound to it. Wherever it goes, you go." Holly shook her head. No, no. That can't be true." The train whistle pierced the air, loud and sharp. The wall seemed to pulse with it, vibrating as the sound grew deafening. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and she could feel the pull of the train again, tugging at her, drawing her back toward it. And then, with a terrifying jolt, the house itself seemed to shift. The walls stretched impossibly, bending and twisting like the distorted carriages of the phantom train. Her home was becoming part of it. Holly screamed, running toward the front door. But it was too late. The door slammed shut before she could reach it, trapping her inside. The train whistle blared again, and the floor beneath her gave way. She fell through the darkness, her surroundings warping and twisting until she was no longer in her house at all. She was back on the train. The same dim lights, the same flickering shadows. Only now the train was full. The passengers stared at her from their seats, hollow-eyed, pale, lifeless. The man and woman were among them, their cold smiles fixed on her. Holly staggered to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. She had escaped once, but now the train had claimed her. There was no escape this time. The train's wheels clattered rhythmically beneath her, and Holly realized with a sickening certainty where it was headed. She was on the phantom train again, and this time it was taking her to its final destination. The lights flickered one last time, and as the train plunged into the eternal night, Holly knew she was no longer among the living. The phantom train had found her, and now she was one of them. Forever. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.